Well, I wanted to take this opportunity also to talk through some of the issues that I'm currently working through and thinking through at the moment with my research. I want to talk to you about my current thinking about how we can feel at home in our dwellings, in the properties in which we live, and what that might have to do with systems of housing ownership and management. What I'm going to present you today is actually based on findings from research projects that I've been involved with, but I'm not going to actually present you the findings because there's not time, so you have to trust me that what I'm telling you is true, and if you want evidence I can tell you about it later on. All right, so my focus in this presentation is on dwellings, and particularly on the ways in which people can come to consider their dwellings as significant places. I want to talk about how the control that a person has over their dwelling can influence the ease with which they can become attached to and concerned about their dwellings as home places. And Ted will recognise some of his own words in that sentence, hopefully. My argument, to give it away at the beginning, and then I'll explain it, is that recent changes in the relative control that increasing numbers of people in Australia have over their dwellings might actually be opening up an opportunity to challenge deeply held ideas about the relationships between dwelling and control in this country, which are tied up with particular notions of home ownership. And that in turn, that challenge, might open up the possibility of social change that would consider how to support more people to feel at home in the dwellings in which they live. So, as an aside, this is a bit of a utopian vision, but I don't think it's completely out of the question, so bear with me as I explain. This extract comes from a speech made by Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister back in 1942, and I think it provides a reasonably succinct example of the importance of home ownership in Australian society from around that period until now. In particular, it voices the importance of control over the dwelling in which one lives, or in the phrases here, into which no stranger may come against our will. Over the 70 years since this speech was made, home ownership, as opposed to rental housing, note the difference in language, maintains an important meaning in Australian society. And I found this graph in an excellent report, and her report by Wendy Stone and colleagues down in Melbourne. And you can see that around the time that Menzies was making his speech was also a time when there were significant changes happening in the housing market, and when home ownership was promoted very heavily by the government. So since the 1940s, when Menzies was making his speech, the ownership of property has been strongly linked in the minds of most Australians, I'd argue, with a sense of control and of autonomy. In comparison, there's been a common assumption that rental housing is a short-term stopgap before purchasing a home of one's own. But I think that there's changes currently afoot in Australia that might lead to another step change in how Australians understand their dwellings as homes. There's two significant changes that are beginning to shake the foundations on which these assumptions around home ownership and its meaning have rested. One is that there are increasing numbers of people who are now long-term private renters, meaning they've been renting in private rental for more than 10 years. And many of those people have little chance of becoming home owners or property owners. There are also increasing numbers of people living in apartments. And in Australia, the vast majority of those apartments are strata-titled apartments, which is a different type of ownership, and I'll explain that in a minute. So I want to talk you through what these changes have to do with people's control over their dwellings. So a third of private renters currently have been renting for 10 years or more. In 1994, that figure was a quarter, so you can see it's rising quite rapidly. And private rental is not only the domain of young singles and couples as they save a deposit for their first home, and many children and older people live in these longer-term private rental households in Australia. Despite this, in Australia, private renters have relatively little control over their dwellings. No grounds terminations are allowed, and frequent rent increases are allowed in many states. In New South Wales, those are unlimited. Private renters also require permission from their landlords to make changes to their dwellings, in many cases very minor changes. That lack of control amongst private rental households, I'd argue, has been largely taken for granted in Australia, but it's not intrinsic to private renting. There are other countries around the world which have very large private rental sectors but afford much more control over private rental housing to their private renters. Germany is an excellent example. Germany is very heavily dominated by a private rental system. Much of that private ownership is owned by small-scale mum and dad investors who own one or two properties like it is in Australia, and yet in Germany no grounds terminations are not allowed and rent increases are controlled, for example. So now on to apartment living. Many of you who are planners at least would be very aware that there have been compact city policies implemented all around the world, policies that are aimed at promoting growth in dwellings within existing urban areas, and typically that's achieved by building attached dwellings, many of those apartments. Australia is no exception. All of the 5 major cities all have metropolitan strategies that promote urban consolidation in Australia. Now in Australia, the majority of apartment dwellings are strata titled. And 1 in 8 Australians, or 3 million people, already live in strata title properties in Australia, and that number is going to increase significantly as more and more apartments are built. Now, in common with other dualistic forms of ownership overseas, and I'll explain that term in a minute, examples include condominiums in the US. People who buy into strata schemes, they purchase individual ownership of their unit, and then they also purchase a share in the collective ownership of the apartments and grounds. So in New South Wales, for example, if you purchase a strata unit, you purchase the airspace inside the paint on the walls, the ceiling and the carpet, and all of the interior walls, fixtures and fittings, and then you purchase a joint share in the building and the grounds and the land. Apartment owners, therefore, don't have the same degree of control over their properties as people who buy detached properties. And that can cause all sorts of challenges in regards to the way people relate to their dwellings or live in their dwellings. On the one hand, people can get frustrated when they're unable to make changes to their individual apartment without the permission of all of the other owners. A very good example of that is people who need to have home modifications, such as grab rails, put in on common walls, who need to get permission from their owners' corporations to do so. And on the other hand, people can fail to meet their responsibilities to get involved with the management and upkeep of the property as a whole. So the rise of long-term private rental and strata ownership can be seen as a reduction in the control that people have over their dwellings. Renters have less control than owners, and strata owners have less control than owners of detached properties. The question is, what are the implications of that for whether and how people experience their dwellings as home places? Now, people constantly negotiate their experiences and understandings of places as they go about their lives, and we've heard about that throughout the day. And some places hold considerable social, psychological and emotional meanings for people. The places of greatest personal significance are often referred to as home places, and in many cases, people do consider the place in which they live to be home, their dwelling. The link between a person's dwelling place and their well-being and identity has long been recognised by housing researchers, by architects, and by planners. And I think that that link finds a theoretical explanation through the concept of place and an understanding of home as a particularly significant type of place. Now here I want to draw on Ted, as he prefers to be called, Ted's conceptualisations of the way in which people identify of and with places, to consider how people identify of and with their dwellings as home places. He explains that identity of a place relates to the persistent sameness and unity of the place that allows it to be differentiated from others, and that identity with a place is related to whether people experience a place as an insider or an outsider, and how attached, involved and concerned they are with that place. But the ease with which people feel like an insider and the extent to which they can become attached and concerned about the places where they live can differ as a result of the ability that they have to remain in a place and to become involved with that place. Many other academics have also recognised that an important relationship exists between control over one's dwelling and whether one feels at home there, as these quotes demonstrate. Thinking about these issues in terms of identity of and with a place This relates to the opportunities people have to remain in a dwelling and to become involved with that dwelling. Some people are afforded more opportunities to remain in their dwellings and become attached, involved and concerned with their dwellings than other people are. So this quote is from Saunders and Williams, who are writing in the UK context, but I think it sums up the situation pretty well in Australia as well. But the increasing numbers of people who are living in apartments and people who are living in rental long term rather than transitioning into home ownership, as was the previous assumption, might be forcing more and more people to question these types of cultural assumptions about the dwelling as home and about the role of home ownership. So what does this mean? Well, the first step in looking at how we can change and improve the housing system is to look at the social and cultural norms that underpin it. And we're in an interesting time in Australia, I think, because of these important changes in the housing system that have the potential to lead to a broader scale questioning of the social and cultural norms that have underpinned the system for decades, since at least the 1940s. The two changes that I've spoken about, an increase in long-term private rental and an increase in apartment living, have both resulted in a loss of control over dwellings. As control is an important aspect influencing the ability of people to feel at home in their dwellings, does this mean that more and more Australians will find it difficult to feel at home in the places in which they live? I think the answer to that question is possibly, but not necessarily. It might be that these changes are enough to enable a reconsideration of the role of ownership and by extension the role of private rental in Australian society. And I think that a shift in social understandings of rental ownership is both possible and important. And I'll give you two examples of why I think it's both possible and important. First, the commodification of dwellings has impacted on the ability of many people to feel attached, involved and concerned with them and to relate to them as home. An example is the prioritisation of landlords' rights to realise a profit quickly by being able to rapidly increase rents and to sell properties quickly, which is one of the main purposes for no grounds termination, in Australia has significant impact on whether tenants can feel secure in their ability to remain in a place and their willingness to become involved and concerned with the place that they may be forced to leave. If dwellings were to be considered as places to dwell first and foremost, and items to invest in second, and if tenancy legislation and associated government policies were to follow suit by providing better security of tenure and more control to tenants over their dwellings, then many private renters may find that they are better able to become attached, involved and concerned with the places in which they live. My second example. The dominant understanding of home ownership in Australia to date has been based primarily on owner occupation of a detached house on its own land. And that's led to significant confusion and dispute amongst those owners who've purchased strata title properties, believing that they would have the same or a similar type of control over their dwellings, but find that they do not. Multiple disputes in these buildings revolve around an individual owner finding they can't do as they please in their dwelling. For example, they can't smoke if their smoke is wafting into common areas or into neighbours' properties, even within their own units. They can't make renovations without permissions. They can't delay repairs for personal financial reasons. And if they can't pay, then they are liable to pay, even if that means having their apartment repossessed. There's a slow shift in understanding now that different types of ownership, like strata ownership, bring with them different degrees of control. But they also bring with them different opportunities. In this case, they bring with them opportunities to cooperate, specifically to pool resources and work collectively with other co-owners. And the reason that I think it's possible there could be a shift in social understandings of ownership in Australia is because of these examples. More people are starting to question the Australian dream, because for many it is not achievable. And in one sense, that's a pity, but in another it provides hope. And my hope is that we might be seeing the beginning of a cultural shift in the way that people relate to their dwellings, a shift that recognises that dwellings are important sites to which people can become attached, involved and concerned, and a recognition that people can and should be afforded the possibility of becoming attached, involved and concerned with their dwellings, irrespective of whether in the case of tenants or how in the case of strata owners they own those dwellings as commodities. Thanks.